Thank you very much, Ismail. So I'm going to be dropping some resources in the Solutions Resources chat as I present, just so everybody's aware. So I am Adam Dudley, and thank you to SANS for being such excellent, well-organized hosts, and to all of you for being here today. I know you have many choices about how to spend your time, so I feel privileged you chose to spend it here today. So I'm excited to guide you through this aspect of cybersecurity that all of us at Nucleus are very passionate about. And it's what we think of as strategic prioritization of vulnerabilities, or what we sometimes call intel-led vulnerability management. So we really believe this approach is a better way to create a better future for this small niche of cybersecurity we work in, vulnerability management. It really is a small niche. When I first started in cyber, someone sent me a mind map that showed all the different areas and dimensions of cybersecurity. And down in the bottom left, out of hundreds of bubbles on this mind map, vulnerability management was just one piece of the overall puzzle. So I do recognize that it's a small niche. In the time that I've been with Nucleus Security and talking about vulnerability management, it has become a much hotter topic. Just in the 4 years that I've been in this little space. And so what I've seen in my career is that it's gone from a practitioner level conversation. Now it's transitioned into an upper management and even board level conversation because, you know, the rise of ransomware and those types of things. But anyway, I have 25 to 30 minutes to present today, so I'm going to be moving quickly and just at a moderate level of depth so I can give you a good overview of these topics, and then you can go look at some of the resources that I'm going to provide you with and do your own homework and learn more about these topics. So this is really about how we're going to bring together real-time threat intelligence that's been tailored to the vulnerability landscape with tools and frameworks like CVSS and SSVC, which can help you and your team prioritize the riskiest vulnerabilities in your environment with more speed and precision, so you can prevent breaches due to exploitation. So let's dive in and explore how this can enhance your cybersecurity program. So this is an important topic because we have challenges with prioritization. I'm not sure there's anybody tuned in right now who wouldn't disagree with that. I know this is to be true because each year I get the privilege of going to various events that Nucleus is participating in. And I literally last year spoke with hundreds of security leaders and executives, both here in the US and elsewhere over in Europe and even South Africa. So I could say with certainty that there are tons of organizations out there with huge backlogs of known vulnerabilities and unknown vulnerabilities. So the bottom line is there are too many vulnerabilities in our environment, and the volume of vulnerabilities is increasing all the time. That plus bad actors are becoming more capable with today's technology. More amateurish bad actors can become capable with today's technology in terms of hacking. And so that creates a big recipe for problems for us. And so we're going to talk about certain approaches like CVSS today and SSVC, CVSS being what I would call legacy prioritization methodology at this point. But we'll discover that even with technologies like CVSS that have been around for a while, when used in isolation or incorrectly, they have their shortcomings. And even newer approaches like SSVC, EPSS, which I'll drop a little mention in later, these things are not a panacea. So we're going to cover some ideas about how you can make these workable for you. But if we're going to get better at this critical phase of vulnerability management and prevent breaches, the solution we've come up with at Nucleus is that you really have to increase the speed and precision of prioritization and remediation, because that's the only way you're going to stay on top of that huge backlog that's always building in the background. So not too long ago, a study came out that showed exploitation of known vulnerabilities surpassed phishing as the #1 initial attack vector. Quick story, I'm reading a book right now called Good Strategy, Bad Strategy. It's required because the word strategic is in my job title. But anyway, that's by a consultant and a researcher named Richard Rummelt, and who's the foremost expert on strategy. And in the first few pages, the author has a beautifully clear and elegant definition of strategy, which I really like. And that definition is a coherent response to a high-stakes challenge. A coherent response to a high-stakes challenge. And I think a lot of you would agree on this call that a huge backlog of vulnerabilities, some of which are going to be able to be exploited by bad actors, that qualifies as a high-stakes challenge because we don't want to suffer a breach in our organization. So when you have a strategy, you need resources aligned with it so you can execute on it. And today I'm going to give you some of those resources to consider for your response to the high-stakes challenge of rapidly resolving the truly critical vulnerabilities in your environment before the attackers do. So here are a few high-level characteristics of CVSS and SSVC. The important thing to know about these tools is not only that they are inverse acronyms. I don't know what clever person at the SSVC creation team came up with the acronym, but it is inverse to CVSS, if you didn't notice. The important thing to know is that these are just tools. And it's possible to use any tool well or poorly when it comes to vulnerability prioritization. And as we know, a strategy is a coherent response or set of responses and actions to a high-stakes challenge. I'm going to repeat it a few times so it really gets embedded in your brain because I like the definition so much. For example, there are many wrong ways to use a hammer, right? You can drive a nail with a hammer or you can smash your thumb. It's all about your level of familiarity and skill with the hammer and your strategy for using it. So I'm willing to assume that almost everybody on this call is familiar with CVSS. SSVC might be new to some, and we're going to get some background on that for you today. SSVC came out in 2019, and it's all about streamlining decision-making processes around vulnerability management and prioritization in the context of the unique perspective or data that the different stakeholders in the process have. And CVSS, as many of us probably know, it's really concerned with technical severity and giving you a score to work from to decide what to work on first, second, and third, and fourth. So a little bit more about CVSS. CVSS is now in version 4.0. I'm going to go back one here. CVSS is now in version 4.0, and among other changes to the new version, it has more granularity with the addition of more base metrics and values. And one specific difference is that there used to be a temporal metric, which has now been replaced by a threat metric. And so quickly, the metrics that combine to produce the base score of CVSS are supplemental, threat, and environmental. And the base score is comprised of intrinsic characteristics and assumes the worst case impact of this vulnerability being exploited. The supplemental attributes are extrinsic to the vulnerability and provided by you to the equation. The threat component is things like exploitation and is there proof of concept of an exploit? And that's also provided by you. And then the other metric is environmental. So this has to do with your unique user environment, and that goes into the equation for calculating CVSS. So as you can see with CVSS, a lot of the scoring is dependent on the data you provide to inform the calculation. So I'm going to drop my first resource here into the 2B Solutions resources chat. This is a free course on CVSS 4.0 that I took in preparation for this presentation. First.org is the organization responsible for maintaining and also enhancing CVSS as a cybersecurity tool. So please do take a look at that. To talk a little bit more about SSVC. So SSVC uses a decision tree model to score vulnerabilities into 4 categories, and it takes into account 5 decision points, each with unique vectors. So this even gets a little bit more complex than CVSS. And those vectors are things like, or the 5 vectors are exploit existence, technical impact, exploit automation, mission prevalence, and public well-being impact. And the 4 possible decisions, again, remember SSVC is a decision-making framework, so the 4 decisions you can make based on the unique vectors I just listed are track, track with an asterisk, attend and act. And so track is just to track the vulnerability. Track with the asterisk means track, but keep a really close eye on it. Attend means that the vulnerability needs to be attended to, but it's also okay to wait for when it's in cycle to deal with it. And then the last decision is act, which is we need to drop everything and act on this vulnerability now. And I did have a graphic showing what the decision tree looks like, but looks like it wasn't included here. So I'm going to drop a link later that will show you what a decision tree model. But in the meantime, if you just want to Google SSVC decision tree, you can start to see what that looks like. So SSVC, it's specifically designed to help you triage when there's more than you can handle, which, as we established earlier, is pretty much always, right? I'd be interested to know, I don't think there's a way for you to interact, but I would love to know if anybody actually has a 100% complete and total handle on your vulnerabilities and backlog today. I think that there would be very few of you that could answer yes to that question. So even though vulnerabilities might be prioritized using CVSS or SSVC or some other methodology, it's not always obvious what to do about the vulnerabilities after they've been prioritized. So there's situations where maybe there's not a patch yet, or the patching of the vulnerability has other adjacent costs associated with it, and it's not clear whether it's worth it to actually patch the vulnerability. So SSVC doesn't necessarily help you with that component of it. It's really about deciding what deserves to be worked on first, second, third, and so on. And I'm going to drop another free training for you. This is on CIS's website. And I also took this course. And this is a great introduction with some practical hands-on examples of how to use SSVC in the practical world. So limitations, you can't talk about tools without talking about limitations. So CVSS has a built-in limitation of it being slightly complex to use. And so what I hear out there in the practitioner space is that folks end up using the base score of CVSS without using any of the other metrics I described earlier. So without using the threat, supplemental, or environmental, or temporal, if you're using the older versions of CVSS. So remember, those additional metrics that go into the CVSS calculation, those have to be provided by you. And what's happening out there in the cybersecurity space is people are using just the base CVSS score. And that's when, you're listening to the podcast or reading the news or following your threat feeds, and a CVSS of 9 or 10 comes out and everybody freaks out. But sometimes you're freaking out because you haven't added the additional context onto that yet. So it's really important that if you're going to use one of these tools, especially CVSS, that you're using the other metrics in combination to get scores that are actually meaningful to you and your unique environment. So with previous versions of CVSS, first.org, again, the maintainer of CVSS, they recognized that one of the weaknesses of CVSS was that there was no threat component. And so they had to add the threat component, again, provided by you, so that there could be more real-time intel involved in the scoring of CVSS. And I'm going to drop a link to an article in the Slack about CVSS, specifically 4.0, so you can learn more. Now, SSVC, again, is relatively new, so it's not widely known necessarily. And it's also difficult to do without the right processes or technology in place. So as you saw, there's a decision tree component and several different vectors, and you need to be able to efficiently apply that to your vulnerability situation. And I'm going to drop one more link to an article about SSVC if you want to continue learning. So to reiterate, either of these tools used in isolation or incorrectly without the right training or strategy may result in risky vulnerabilities being missed. So the topic of this presentation was how to combine frameworks like CVSS and SSVC with vulnerability intelligence to get better outcomes for your vulnerability management program. So I'm going to start at the beginning and just walk through what we feel as an organization working with some of the world's largest organizations, what works and what is the appropriate setup for a solid vulnerability management program. So number one, to do vulnerability management well, you first need to do asset management well, which in fact is why a lot of orgs struggle with VM, because if you don't know what you have, which many organizations do not have a complete picture of their assets, if you don't know that, it's hard to determine not only where the vulnerabilities are, but how critical or sensitive they are in the context of the assets. And how can you assess your vulnerabilities with any kind of completeness or accuracy if you don't know where your assets are, what they are, and so on. So once you know what you have and you're assessing for vulnerabilities on a regular schedule, you need to continuously monitor the life cycle of the vulnerabilities in your environment to ensure you know what's going on and that nothing slips through the cracks. After that, you need to correlate the vulnerabilities in your environment with threat intelligence that's specific to the vulnerability landscape and taking into account the criticality of the assets in your environment. This, in our model of Intel-led vulnerability management, is how you get at the true criticals, which by some accounts is only 2 to 3% of all the vulnerabilities in your environment actually warrant your attention right now today. And why do we want to use vulnerability intelligence? Because it tells us things like which vulnerabilities are being actively exploited in the wild, by which threat actors or APT crews. It tells us about vulnerabilities being used in malware and 0 days and how easily they can be exploited. It also talks about impact to the CIA triad. You want to use high quality sources of vulnerability intelligence in tandem with frameworks like CVSS and SSVC to decide what to work on first, second, third, and so on. For example, maybe you have a CVE with CVSS of 9.0 that comes into your environment, but based on your asset context, which asset that CVE is affecting, and the intelligence you have about that vulnerability, you happen to know it's a very low likelihood of being exploited. Or maybe you run it through the SSVC decision tree and realize it's a matter that needs to be attended to, just not out of cycle. So you choose that attend to decision in the SSVC decision tree. And finally, in our world, you really want to be able to automate as much of this as possible because it is truly nearly impossible for a single individual or team, especially in larger scaled up organizations, to keep up with an ever increasing volume of vulnerabilities. So how do we actually put this into practice? How do we operationalize threat intelligence that's been specifically tailored to the vulnerability landscape? So the way to prioritize strategically in our view, and again, what's a strategy? The coherent response to the high stakes challenge of preventing breaches in this case. The way you do it is by rapidly and identifying and remediating the vulnerabilities that threat intel says are being actively exploited in the wild, and add another layer of detail, vulnerabilities that are being used by threat actors to actually target your industry or even your specific company. So we believe that this ensures you're allocating resources, limited resources, in the best way possible to get the most bang for your buck in terms of reducing risk from known vulnerability exploitation. Now, there's a couple things on this slide that is not officially part of this presentation that I wanted to mention, which is the CISA KEV list. The CISA KEV list is something that we're big fans of here at Nucleus. It's a free resource, a publicly available resource that can get you into the threat intel game because this is a list of vulnerabilities that have proof of exploitation. So if you're not already familiar with the CISA KEV list, do get familiar with it and check it out. Again, this is only going to apply one of those CISA KEV vulnerabilities. It's only going to be critical for you if it meets certain characteristics of your unique environment, if it is on sensitive assets, those types of things. EPSS is another interesting technology to take a look at. EPSS can be an enhancement or even a contrast to CVSS. EPSS was designed using machine learning by some researchers out of Carnegie Mellon, I believe. And what EPSS seeks to do is predict out 30 days vulnerabilities, the likelihood that they're going to be exploited. So whereas something like CVSS deals with today, the here and now, and possibly the past, EPSS deals with the future and trying to use software technology like ML to determine what is in my environment that is likely to be exploited in the future. At the very top of the triangle here to the upper left, you see what the ultimate goal is for Intel-led vulnerability management, which is every day coming to work and knowing specifically which vulnerabilities in your environment are being actively exploited by threat actors targeting your industry or even your company. And knowing with certainty and confidence that those are the ones that deserve your attention now and today. So how did we get here to this Intel-led model? So we started off back in the day with just scanners. We just wanted to identify vulnerabilities, and that's what scanners were good at. And then scanners realized, oh, there might need some additional context in terms of the severity of all these vulnerabilities because there's a lot of them. And so that's when scanning companies brought in at CVSS, so you could get a CVSS score along with your identified vulnerabilities by the scanning. And so what we have today is we now have the means and intelligence to know which vulnerabilities are being actively exploited, which are 0 days, which have malware, and which threat actors are using these CVEs to attack specific industries. And to me, this means we now have a scalpel for prioritizing what we attend to and work on, because we know just a very small percentage of these in our environment are actually truly critical based on our unique asset context and what the intel tells us. And again, the holy grail here is to automate and operationalize as much of the decision-making process as possible so that you can actually get on track to automate things like prioritization and initiating remediation activities on those vulnerabilities that are truly critical. So the integration of vulnerability intelligence not only facilitates a more rapid response to the riskiest threats, but it also contributes to the reduction of attack surfaces. And all this adds up to a reduction in breach potential, which is our purpose. So with that, let's look at a quick case study of an actual company that was able to operationalize this approach that I've been describing here today. So this is an Australian utilities and telecom provider, and they were a new security team, sort of just getting started with their processes, but they embraced this approach of Intel-led vulnerability management. And so they quickly zeroed in. They had 13,000 vulnerabilities, and they quickly zeroed in on the 40 vulnerabilities, 40, that were being exploited in the wild by a threat actor group that was targeting utilities and telecom in Australia. So within 30 days, they rallied the whole team and got everyone to focus on just remediating and fixing those 40 vulnerabilities, and they were able to do it. And so they did it, and they were able to report to their leadership and other stakeholders and say, we reduced our widely exploitable vulnerabilities by 100% this month. We wiped them all out, and here's how we did it. And so this process or this strategy of Intel-led vulnerability management is about the actual remediation, but it's also about being able to communicate crisply and confidently about what you're able to achieve. And for this team, why they chose to focus on those 40 vulnerabilities over and above all the many other thousands of vulnerabilities in their environment. So this strategy gives you a whole new way to communicate with clarity that you're certain in your approach. And then this gives all stakeholders more confidence in the program. So I hope you know what a strategy is by now. It's a cohesive response or set of responses to a high stakes challenge. Hopefully you take that with you. And so in our view, strategic prioritization, it's not just a necessity, it's actually a strategic advantage against attackers. And by integrating vulnerability intelligence with established frameworks like CVSS and newcomers like SSVC, maybe EPSS, you can make more informed decisions, you can optimize your resource allocation, and establish a more proactive defense against cyber threats. So if you want to learn more about these topics and gain more skills, I suggest checking out the training resources I shared in the chat. Visit the CISA website and the first.org websites. There's a lot of great things in there regarding, CVSS, SSVC, those types of things. And that's my time. It looks like I have 4 minutes for questions. What questions do we have, Ismail?
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Again, very practical. I love the use cases, the references. So while we give additional time for the audience to ask questions, I see a bunch of memes. I love this competition, the meme competition. That's amazing.
I'm a big fan of memes myself, so it's
Oh,
very
there's a lot of
exciting. I can't
really
wait
good
to see them.
ones. Yeah, and really good ones in there. But let me ask you, since we're talking about resources as well, what are some of the resources you would recommend? Sources where we can find threat intelligence that it's curated, appropriate for this type of vulnerability prioritization.
Sure. So I'm going to give a biased answer first because we're very deep partners with Mandiant. We went through a process at Nucleus where we had to choose one sort of capstone vulnerability management provider to embed their product in our product. And our founders come from a practitioner background, so they're very particular and looked at half a dozen or more Vulnintel providers, and they landed on Mandiant. So Mandiant's offerings, of course, come with a price tag, and that might not be accessible to everyone, but we're big fans of Mandiant. So to get a start, I would go to these free organizations that I mentioned. So the CISA Kev list, CISA SSVC, first.org. In fact, I'll mention their first.org is doing their first event ever later this year called VulnCon. So they're bringing people together now around the specific topic. And so that's something to look into as well.
That's so appropriate. I was looking at, with this discussion in mind, I was having with somebody a few days ago. I was looking at how many vulnerabilities were issued by by the government, like the CVEs, right? In the last few months, and in the last quarter, I think it was like in the magnitude of several thousands, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
It's an ever increasing volume, and with that, it's literally impossible to keep up. And so we absolutely need this strategy and this approach to ensure that we're just focusing in on the things that actually matter to our unique situation.
Absolutely. We have a very good question from Jeff. I love these questions around people and processes, right? How many people do
Sure.
you think it would take to run an efficient vulnerability management program for the security side?
That's a great question. So we have um, we have case studies here at Nucleus where, we have huge teams as customers and we have individuals as customers. And so I think there's this balance of people, technology, and process. Like what I described today, I know for a fact it's possible to do it for one person to do it, if you can believe that, like with the right technology and process. In other cases, depending on the scope of the whole organization, it's going to take a lot more people. But I hate to answer with this generality, but it really is dependent on the environment. Like, what skills do you have? What resources do you have? How big is your team? What's your current situation? Are you even scanning yet? There's a lot of questions that have to be answered to answer that question.
And it's probably the case that, you can't start with something smaller, maybe one person, as you said, right? And,
Yeah.
and you probably have all the responsibilities but demonstrating value,
Mhm.
like demonstrating value maybe based on some of the ideas and metrics that you shared.
That's a
And,
great point.
from there, it's easier to ask for more resources, right? Or it's easier to get them
Yeah.
what demonstrated some
Yeah.
value.
Yeah. When you can clearly communicate and say, okay, we scan and we have 13,000 vulnerabilities. We used vulnerability intelligence to tell us what the 40 out of the 13,000 are that are actually being exploited by attackers attacking our industry. And we remediated those. That story resonates really well with all the stakeholders in the organization. So that's what this strategy is trying to get you to.
Right? Or how much time you're saving us from, doing other things like the remediation, the
That
cost, the
too.
impact.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
I absolutely knew there's organizations out there that are just remediating all CVSS based. and sometimes just base score. They're not even calculating out using the metrics I mentioned. And so they're ending up wasting a lot of resources by just focusing on CVSS.
Absolutely. Very, very good. Good points. Let me see. Do we have more questions here? So we have a URL from Nucleus Security. Any other questions from the audience? Maybe while we give it a couple of more minutes.
Sure.
Maybe any other experiences that you've had where by applying this strategy, organizations were able to uh, save, from a massive campaign that was, going to happen in a few weeks. Like how can we implement this concept to anticipate the adversary? That's something I'm obsessed with, right? Like how do we anticipate adversaries? They pretty much know what we're going to be doing in most cases. Like how can we try to be like a step ahead? I know it's not always possible, but
Sure.
some maybe examples, real world examples that you have seen.
Sure. Well, I think by running a good a good vulnerability management program, which I would put in the bucket of cyber hygiene, by running a program, you're continuously closing off any gaps there might be in your systems for attackers to exploit. So, I like vulnerability management because it's on the proactive and not the reactive side. And so I think that by building up a strong program based on vulnerability intelligence, because vulnerability intelligence from excellent vendors by Mandiant and other companies like them, that's about as real time as you can get, right? Like they have hundreds and hundreds of human analysts that are out there in the world, on the dark web monitoring these groups, and that's about the closest I think the average person, unless you have a threat hunting team, that's about the closest the average person can get to having real-time visibility into what the attackers are doing and planning to do.